Retired savior falls into a hammer of 40,000, which is not considered retirement. Introduction. One-sentence summary. After saving the human race, Gudazi falls into a 40k Warhammer and begins the story of saving the galactic-level human race. Notes. It started with the phrase, "Most of those who crossed the Warhammer have become big guys, but I want to see the little humans struggling in terms of height among the Warhammer big guys," but gradually it has little to do with the phrase, "sad." Because Cloud Hammer didn't know enough about hammers, they tried to achieve mutual prosperity with the Moon Hammer, but the end result was neither the moon nor the hammer, and they even pinched many strange things, basically all of which were serious nonsense. Strictly set the party and be cautious in entering. After all, Hammer 40,000 is Hammer 40,000, so it's a big surprise for Gudazi, otherwise he wouldn't be able to play the author's favorite family reunion, covering his face. In order to play the author's favorite family reunion, a lot of hope was added to the 40k empire. Maybe it's not hammery enough. Right from scratch, everything is subject to the author's satisfaction, and write anytime to make mistakes. Unable to squeeze into the main text, there is a high probability that no one wants to see the detailed QA. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Q. What is the current timeline? A. The basic plan is probably around the beginning of Regency, the end of the Indomitable expedition, and a certain point in time before the outbreak of the Plague War. The specifics are actually not easy to calculate, cannot be determined, because in a sense, Guda will become the lifelong enemy of Time Court. If Time Court can find her. Lingzi transfer was originally developed as a technology for time travel, and its versatility is also reasonable, right? Q. What is the current team composition? A. Guda, Kaz, Somni, the 40k Bat Cubs who were locked up, 18 of them, stripped of their armor, washed clean, and locked in a room to be imprisoned, Guda's dormitory guard unit, various plush toys and similar products, responsible for guarding the Bat Cubs in various ways. Q. Why does currently only Savita find Guda dressed strangely? A. Because Savita is an Astarte with a bit of chaos resistance, against magic. Guda's ceremonial attire has a bit of cognitive interference magic, which can eliminate her sense of discord on a cognitive level, not because the magic sees her differently, but because the magic thinks it's very normal for her to do so. But this magic is not very strong, it can only deceive 40k mortals, and can generally be easily seen through Astarte. The 18 Bat Cubs who were caught also felt the same way, but they currently have no say. The Forbidden Army and the pathogen can certainly see through, but the other two people on the ship have become accustomed to it. Q. What can the Otanoslingi exoskeleton of Guda do? A. It is possible to conceptually extract all the ceremonial attire from the Guda box, or borrow the power of the spirit through the fate of the spiritual portrait. Because the spirit is obviously a subspace creature, Guda demon, in the worldview of Hammer 40,000, it is obviously unwise to actually summon the moon spirit separated by the dimensional wall without the Emperor's cover. Guda is too weak, the demon is upside down, and Guda cannot protect the spirit at all. Generally, if the spirit comes over, there is a risk of being intercepted by the four vendors. After all, some spirits look really chaotic. So, Guda greeted the spirits in advance and said that I might borrow your power in such a way that when needed, I would extract data from the spirit base portrait and fit an unconscious but equally powerful subspace entity into the spirit base exoskeleton. This step requires the consent of the spirit body and some help from the other side, otherwise Otanus's crude equipment may not have enough computing power. And then Guda, magical girl, transformed, controlled the exoskeleton to fight. In terms of the moon, it is a simulated follower who transforms into a dreamlike form using the spirit card, and in terms of the hammer, it can also be said to be a type of enchanted warrior, pure version. For example, in the case of Xinjiang, Guda wanted to insert an Ajiao plugin for himself, but halfway through the project, he realized it was too slow to catch up, so he took out the Ajiao shield, Achilles' stumbling gift, first. Because this is also an Ajiabeo tool, which can be considered as part of the same spiritual base, it is equivalent to taking something out of the box and grabbing it from the left or right side. basically no difference, so the process of installing plugins has not been interrupted. After Guda defended herself, she was originally planning to continue the project and use Ajiao's spirit base to shoot the dual room and force a 1-on-1 arena match against the opponent, but she didn't expect the enemy to be so far away from her that she couldn't speak to them. Anyway, the result is good. Calling the E-demon out or summoning heroes in areas where the Emperor can continue to provide protection, such as the devout Catholic Church or within the storm border, doesn't have to be so troublesome. You can call whatever you want. But generally, there is still a risk of being corrupted by chaos if a hero is discovered when going out. Q, as an armed force, what exactly is their positioning? A. The current definition of this team is a small-scale rapid response advanced team. On the parts that require puzzle solving and communication, on the parts that require public power endorsement, on the Somni, when encountering a scene that requires fighting, the first thing to do is to paste a cause onto the opposite face, and then everyone will fight together before the enemy reacts. Because the team size is too small, in the sense of saving lives before the plan officially starts, this firepower is actually very excessive. They are even really solving problems for the Imperial world, at the request of Guda meddling. Q. If there are only 3 serious crew members, how does the ship sail? A. The operational issues mainly rely on Somni, who can now handle most of the processing work in the main control room independently and multi-threaded through the servo system built-in in the powertrain after a little learning. Kaz can theoretically do it, but he's just showing off and not learning, only willing to play around. Although Guda is the captain, she actually doesn't know how to sail, so most of the maintenance and logistics tasks are done by her. Kaz has always felt confused about this. Indeed, he can see her always doing something on the ship, but what she does is basically a drop in the bucket. But the ship is inexplicably fine, the warehouse is inexplicably organized, the medical room always has enough medicine, and even the kitchen refrigerator always has enough ingredients. This is actually because the human foundation value on the ship is very stable, and Guda can summon the spirit foundation shadow to do things without too much consideration for the influence of the subspace. Somni knew this and even had face-to-face encounters with some spirit-based shadows, but Kaz was disliked by the spirits, so everyone walked around him after being summoned. By the way, after the incident with the spirit clan, he would have the illusion that the ship was haunted, but the other 2 felt nothing was wrong and became suspicious for a while. Q. What do they usually eat? What do Guda think about the 40k on her tongue? A. Chaldean supplies, the legitimate food of the second millennium. The other 2 have little interest or demand for the food itself, they follow along and eat. Because people's dietary habits are difficult to change, unless it is urgent to have to eat dirt, Guda still respects the vast majority of military supplies in the 40k region. After all, since ancient times, there has been nothing to eat with British military rations except for small biscuits. In addition, due to some genetic and adaptive reasons, Guda, as an ancient human, is still slightly weaker than the 40k people in terms of physique. Some local foods in the 40k region may be okay for the indigenous people to eat, but Guda may have problems eating them. For example, gulping mocha coffee is a refreshing drink, while drinking Rika coffee may immediately cause tachycardia and sudden death. Stat and mycoplasma also rely on this to refresh, and I estimate the content of stimulants inside will not be small. So for safety reasons, Somni will also keep an eye on her recipe. The things in the warehouse will eventually be finished, so Guda and Somni are currently planning to use 40k magical genetic technology to restore some populations of edible animals and plants in the storm border cold storage queue. Why can storm borders flash through subspaces or even the entire universe when they don't even have the ability to navigate outside the atmosphere? A. The answer is the magical virtual submarine. Hammer's subspace navigation uses a powerful subspace engine to pull a hole in the curtain and then drive into subspace, utilizing the instability of time and space to achieve superluminal navigation. It relies on star torch navigation to determine its position and heading, and finally pulls another hole to return to the material universe. The imaginary diving of the moon utilizes the paper moon throughout its journey. Firstly, let the plane moon calculate the distance and orientation of the destination, and then dive the entire ship into the imaginary space, subspace, to observe and navigate the outside world solely using the plane moon. Accurately ride the chaotic ocean currents in the imaginary space, subspace, to reach the destination, and then float back up to the material universe. Because the part of the 40K human, superluminal travel, mainly relies on the properties of the subspace itself rather than the power of the thrusters, the second millennium submarine can also achieve superluminal travel in the world of hammers without being tiring or troublesome. Also, because Storm Border is a small boat that can stop at any Imperial airport, the process of diving and floating is a self-proof of the conversion between real and imaginary fields, and has no impact on the surrounding environment. Therefore, it is very flexible to leave at any place. By the way, during the process of diving and floating, the shadow border, which serves as the core of the storm border, corrects the time to ensure that there is no tragedy of arriving at the destination hundreds of years later or before departure. By the way, this is something that Somni knows but Kaz is not aware of. He thought that the reason this ship could appear precisely at the time they needed was because it could accurately calculate the time flow in the subspace. Q, your virtual number stealth is very good, why not let the Empire install it? A, the flat moon and shadow border both have only one, so I dare not dismantle them. Shadow border can still shout out the big and small Vinci to ask for design ideas. The moon of the plane is really gone. Iron Hand. In reverse, in reverse. Q, what did Kaz do to get targeted like this? Because Guda almost got killed twice by him. A, because he is the worst hero that Guda has ever led. Yu reading www.yuukangshu.net. But Guda feels this way not because he almost died in his hands, the evil attribute of the spirit almost gave Guda Jia not once or twice, they will not take it to heart, but because he is frantically jumping on the line between cooperating and not cooperating, and this is not the first time he has given Guda the difficulty of whole flower work. Guda didn't specifically target him because of this. He had a lot of intelligence that he didn't know was entirely due to his poor performance and lack of basic knowledge due to his poor performance. However, other spirits did indeed target him as a result, referring to him almost killing Guda twice when he fell ill and went insane. Q, how does Guda care about force, Kaz's personal hygiene situation? A, Guda would use a high-pressure water gun to tease him when he couldn't bear to watch, and he wouldn't go into the bathroom to wash him like a car. It's true that it can't be washed clean, but it's always better than not washing thoroughly. Escaping is useless, Guda will ascend to the heavenly lock, and now the essence of Kaz's subspace is basically equivalent to a divine figure. Q, will Guda lead a legion in the future? A, sure, after completing the Kaz dungeon, Guda actually has the ability to manage the legion and command the battle of the large army, but she doesn't want to. After gathering the bat cubs, she will throw them all back to Kaz, and in small missions, she also chooses to fight alongside only single-digit cans. She may temporarily join a certain organization on the battlefield and tell the commander that I will take you to fight, and then persuade and gain credibility, but she basically does not want to hold direct command of the cannons in the organization for a long time. As for the canned heroes, aren't they all the Emperor's cursed legion? What does the command have to do with me? I'll throw it all to myself and the Emperor. Guda wants to be a free Guda, someone who can run around and die everywhere. A fantasy realm. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Conrad Kaz swiftly and silently moved forward in the darkness of the nightfall. He has been separated from this ship for too long. Normally, he may feel nostalgic, but he did not. His mind was completely filled with frustration, surprise, confusion, and questions, leaving him no time to think about anything else. He urgently needs an answer now. He knew that the person qualified to answer him was on the bridge. Therefore, Conrad Kaz walked smoothly towards the bridge. He didn't hide his figure, but those who passed by him turned a blind eye to his existence. This was originally unimaginable. All those who saw the pathogen on the nightfall would immediately express their respect or fear. But this is not his night number. On the night vessel that belonged to him, the whispers in the darkness would not breed such a relaxed and peaceful atmosphere, and the Estat warriors and mortals would not get along so peacefully. The corridor lacks the decorations that should be everywhere on the Midnight Lord's territory, and even some cabins can faintly hear soothing and melodious music. This is the nightfall, but he feels very unfamiliar with it. However, he was still extremely certain that this was the nightfall, except that the massive lady was dressed up in a different way in the hands of another person. This does not require evidence or logic, it is an instinctive conviction, as it belongs to Conrad Cause's field and is derived from another possibility based on his memory. Although the control of this field does not belong solely to him for the time being, it is only a small matter that makes everyone on the road ignore his existence. He can still easily do it. No one was aware of his existence, so no one came to stop him. Conrad Cause arrived at the bridge smoothly, but before he was ready to break through and ask the owner of the night ship a question, he suddenly hesitated. He didn't really pay much attention to the outside world along the way, but the observation ability of the pathogen still made him unconsciously pay attention to many things. He smelled a faint atmosphere as he walked, mixed with anger, shyness, disgust, and worry. The people on the ship were carrying out some kind of work in an orderly manner, but this was not the state of a legion before the battle, which made him feel slightly puzzled. This little bit of confusion was answered in an instant. Conrad Cause's field responded to him, instinctively knowing what point in time he was at. At this point in his life, he ordered the destruction of Nostromo, his own home planet. He is aware of the causes and consequences of this whole matter, and has no regrets about his decision. But he had just messed up a mortal's life 3 times. Specifically, it was a test of exchanging lives between two sides, and Conrad Cause had undoubtedly failed. And he felt puzzled about it. He wants to know how this ordinary person, who has safely passed through a life where even the pathogen is about to fall, will handle this matter from his perspective. So he chose to quietly pass through the gate of the bridge. Without the door open. Conrad Cause has already figured it out in a series of previous encounters, although they are similar in all aspects, this is not the material world. Moreover, this is his domain again, and it will not restrict him like the current owner of the Nightfall. As long as you master some tricks, it's not difficult to penetrate solids like a subspace demon here, just like how he made everyone along the way ignore him. In the past, being able to acquire such abilities was something that Conrad Cause was ecstatic about. Without a doubt, he can truly become a midnight ghost and a perfect monster through this. But at this moment, it's not important. He has too many questions. He relied on cruelty and fear to demonstrate justice in his own life, but this proved impractical in the life of an ordinary person. Undoubtedly, this mortal showed him that there were other paths through this, but Conrad Coates could not truly see it. What does it rely on to establish itself? How does it operate? What outcome will it lead to? How versatile is it? Or rather, can it be established in places like Nostromo or the 8th Legion? Conrad Cause glided silently in the darkness with so many questions, as if he were a part of the darkness itself. The layout of the bridge remained familiar to him, and he also saw some familiar faces. Several members of the Night Bat Council, but it seemed that they now had other, more specific tasks besides that, as a small group of black armored guards of the Gen Guard, fully armed and wearing helmets, Conrad Cause still distinguished a few specific individuals from subtle details. Finally, of course, it is the pathogen, surrounded by guards. In the rules of this field, this role is played by an ordinary person. Conrad Cause scrutinized the mortal who dragged him into this tedious scene in the dark, and once again came to the same conclusion. She was young, thin, weak, and had nothing special in the eyes of a pathogen. However, even such a person successfully commanded the 8th Legion with their own mind. Although it was just a false illusion based on memory, the girl who was cherished and gathered in the center of the crowd undoubtedly won the respect of all Konrad Kaz's descendants. This doesn't mean much. Legion soldiers are all genetic descendants of the pathogen, and of course they will obey, no matter what the thing that is their pathogen looks like. Konrad Kaz thought maliciously. But as he thought about it, a complex emotion surged into his heart. Yeah, no matter what kind of ghost their pathogen looks like. Even if it's a mortal, or even if it's a lunatic who only knows how to talk to corpses in the dark out of some motive that he himself could not fully understand, he began to hope that this mortal could have something genuine, at least worth the price of a ticket respected by his descendants. Even though he still felt that the vast majority of his descendants were just scumbags and villains. He hates them, and even wants them to die, but the most hateful thing is that genetic connections cannot be severed. They are his sins. Konrad Kaz refused to think downwards and instead shifted his attention to the scene before him. He is already very close and does not conceal his figure. This is his field, so everyone ignored his existence according to his intentions, except for the pathogen, surrounded by guards in the center. A mortal girl, very young, never more than 20 years old, only 5 feet and 2 inches, even by the standards of a mortal woman, appears thin and petite. But she only looked at him and didn't make any specific reaction. They confirmed each other's existence between their eyes, but all communication ended there. This girl did not wear power armor, but instead wore a fitted Nostromo-style women's dress. This may be because in Konrad Kaz's memory, there is no such thing as a humanoid-sized plasma-powered armor, which sounds absurd and may only seem more absurd, but it is not much better now. Her face has soft lines, which can be called a beautiful and lovely phrase among mortals. The skin did not have the pathological pallor of the Nostromo people, but showed a gentle light color under the dim to almost non-existent illumination of the night sky. Her shoulder-length short hair was a dazzling orange-red like a rosy glow, and the light amber sclera in her pupils reflected a faint light like a distant star hanging high in the sky. In short, she was too bright, and the gloomy style displayed by the dark dress on her body showed a spear shield and cut that cannot be ignored. This contradiction and division naturally exist. Konrad Kaz thought, after all, this girl doesn't belong to Nostromo, and she shouldn't even have any connection to this evil planet. When he was thinking this way, he suddenly realized that he had gained some unclear respect for this girl at some point. He knew the name of this little troublemaker. Fujimaru Rika, written in an ancient language that had already passed away, and had a mystical significance due to its antiquity. At least that's what the emperor, his father, said. Konrad Kaz is not certain about this. After all, he has already died. A soul that had already been judged was forcibly dragged out of the prison of death by the emperor, and then bound to a strange trial by a mortal girl with an ancient name. Now it seems that the person who lost very miserably is still him. The whole thing seems so absurd and ridiculous that some details no longer arouse Konrad Kaz's curiosity to explore. He just wants to know where he lost now. He patiently watched as the guards in the illusion reported his investigation results to the pathogens in the illusion. The speaker was Shen, a descendant whom he did not dislike, which gave him a strange sense of relief, perhaps because the descendant whom he did not dislike was originally in this position. He knew exactly what the report was about, so he didn't get distracted and listened carefully. Instead, he carefully observed Shen's pale face, which was not covered by his helmet. The appearance of the original attendants is exactly the same as that in Konrad Kaz's memory. Yu reads www.uukangshu.net, and even the location of the scar is exactly the same. Of course, after all, this is the illusion created based on his memory. But he also feels that this Shen is slightly different from the Shen he knows in an unspeakable place. Shen's report was very detailed, but it didn't take much time either. After the words of the guard fell, the darkness of the bridge returned to tranquility. Everyone, including Konrad Kaz, was holding their breath waiting for the mortal girl in the center of the crowd to make a decision, and she did not make the people present wait long either. Please summon Jando Skullwalk from the 45th Company for me. Tashika Fujimaru quickly gave the first order. I hope to hear his own testimony. Shin nodded to take orders, but his movements were not as sharp. Conrad Kaz was dissatisfied and saw that he was procrastinating. If under his command, Shin would never dare to have such thoughts, because the orders of the pathogen must be immediately executed. This is another difference, and Shin dared to do so for a clear reason. It was not only Conrad Kaz, who was a spectator, who caught his hesitation, but also the girl who received the position of the primordial in the illusion as a mortal realized this. She spoke, but not reprimanding. If you have any doubts about this, Shin, please speak up as usual. You persuade me, or I persuade you. This always brings us better decisions and more determined executors. The thinking of mortals. This is indeed a new path, but Conrad Kaz scoffed at it. The decision made by the pathogen cannot be questioned because it is always the best. Is that so? Thinking of the 3 failures he had just experienced, Conrad Coates began to doubt the viewpoint he had always believed in. 2 Destinies. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. I have no doubt about the order, General. I am aware that even during the trial, the defendant has the right to defend themselves. Shin whispered in a gentle Northramo language. What worries me is. He froze and showed a puzzled expression, as if his language system had abruptly broken down here, making it difficult for him to find suitable words and phrases to express himself. He froze for 3 seconds like this, which was quite a long time for an Astat, but no one urged him, including the pathogen. After such an awkward few seconds, Shin seemed to suddenly vent his anger, nodding to avoid Fujimaru Rika's gaze and sighing, "You are always so kind." Indeed, she is too kind. Conrad Kaz thought discontentedly. Shin dare not speak to him so hesitantly. But in an instant, he realized that the guard's words were not expressing the meaning he understood, because the girl spoke again. "I understand what you mean, Shin." She responded in a whisper like Northramo. "Skullwalk is also a member of the Legion and a Midnight Heir, but he has committed a serious crime. The losses and mistakes have been forged, his identity is meaningless before the law, and his sophistry cannot shake the judgment that should be made. I assure everyone present that I will not show any inappropriate tolerance for this. I need to hear his testimony not only because it is required in the simplest procedures, but also because I need to know what thoughts led him and his family to commit such a crime. Undoubtedly, this is. As the Lord of Nostromo, I suffered a major failure, so I need to know all the details more. I will never forget the past, and as the teacher of the future, only by knowing where I fell can I better avoid similar obstacles in the future. This is the reason why I hope to personally bring the culprit to trial. Can you agree with this reason? So, I have no doubt. Your will be put into practice." This series of explanations seems very unnecessary to Conrad Kaz, but Shin seems to be convinced by it. The guard bowed slightly to Gung, then turned around and left the bridge, briskly carrying out this simple task. His attitude puzzled the true Gung of the Midnight Lord. He is a pathogen, so he can think about many things in a very short time. In that moment, Conrad Kaz analyzed some of the intelligence revealed in the previous conversation, feeling that Shin seemed to be more weak than under his command, and despised this, while also feeling that it was only natural for him to be under the command of an ordinary person. At the same time, he was also wondering how Fujimaru Rika relied on this weak ruling command to command the entire 8th Army, and deduced how he would react in the same situation. But that moment was also very short, because then someone broke the tranquility in the darkness. As Shin wanted to say, "My lord, you are indeed too kind sometimes." The voice that spoke in Gagothic without permission came from among the helmeted black guards. Conrad Kaz recognized this voice as Yago Severitaean, which could be said to be his most desirable heir, or even possibly none. Even under his own command, the captain of Midnight Lord enjoyed a lot of favor and privileges due to his indulgence. But this is still too much. Speaking without the permission of the pathogen in formal occasions is suspected to be a criticism of the pathogen himself, and even Saint Gillis would speak out and reprimand in such situations. Even if it wasn't him who was being questioned, Conrad Kaz was a bit angry about it because he realized from Savita's straightforward tone and the indifferent attitude of others that something similar was never the first time it had happened. In his impression, Yago Sevilla Leon should not be so rude. And in the next moment, he realized that this instinctive thought did not come from facts, but from the beautification of memory. Even in front of him, Savita dared to say anything. Although there were not many instances of him actually doing that. Speaking in front of me. The repeated occurrence of such shameless events is obviously not unrelated to the origin of this Midnight Lord. In Conrad Kaz's view, this is a serious offense, but Toshika Fujimaru clearly doesn't think it's against him. After this uninvited accusation came to fruition, she sighed lightly and replied in Gothic. I think you're right, Savitalian. I'm too kind to Nostromo. This sentence stirred up a slight ripple around. No one really spoke out because of this, but Conrad Kaz smelled some agreement, some confusion, and panic. According to the rules of this field, as a pathogen, Rika Fujimaru should possess exactly the same abilities as when she was a pathogen, and she should have felt the same thing, but she did not immediately provide an explanation. She turned around and paced towards the huge observation window on the bridge. No one has any doubts about this action, everyone knows that outside the window is the eternal star, the source of sin, brightly lit in the darkness, covering the poisonous Sor Nostromo with a false image of prosperity. Fujimaru Rika quietly looked down at the planet for a few seconds, then spoke again. I am too optimistic about its prospects, thinking that after bringing order and peace to it, justice will naturally sprout in the hearts of the residents of Nostromo. She reflected on herself, I overlooked the inertia of the long-accumulated culture itself, and also forgot how easily humans can fall with the environment. This is my mistake, and I will work hard to correct it. So, you still have to give it another chance, Savita couldn't conceal the irony in her voice. Even if you realize the catastrophic consequences of being kind to this planet, you are still so kind. Don't exaggerate, Sevilla Lion. The consequences are indeed something that none of us want to see, but it's a bit too exaggerated to describe it as catastrophic. This is the third time. Even just the third time I know. You know, I didn't join the Legion with you from the beginning. Savita's voice was filled with anger. In Conrad Kaz's experience, Savita rarely allowed himself to express such vivid emotions, but his tone now is indeed filled with anger. This fact, along with his accusations, confused Conrad Kaz for about a microsecond, but in an instant he realized that it was impossible to restrain the sins of Nostromo with the overly lenient means of this mortal girl. Such rebellions or covert actions must have occurred many times, and each time had an impact on the Legion. This angry accusation caused a little commotion. The Black Armor Guard, in shock, immediately attempted to stop their platoon leader through various means, including military force, but this behavior was immediately stopped by the pathogen. It's okay, let him continue. Toshika Fujimaru said calmly, anger is legitimate and proof that he is still human. As a member of the 8th Army and one of the victims of Nostromo's poisoning, he certainly has the right to be angry. This anger is not his own, it is the voice he spoke on behalf of the army. Therefore, whether as the owner of Nostromo or as the commander of the 8th Army, I must bear this anger. But what else do I have to say? You are the master of the Legion, and you must know better than me. Ago Severian's roar intensified with the permission of the pathogen. Time and time again, the new recruits of the Legion were contaminated by scum and villains, the veterans began to form factions, and the conflict between the Nostramos and Terrans intensified. This is just the surface of it. What are the deep-seated hidden dangers brought about by these things? These things always affect your heart, and the progress of the expedition is slowed down because of them. You can't always waste time on these things that shouldn't have happened. What happened? I understand. Fujimaru Rika closed her eyes, her expression mixed with pain and helplessness. My mistake. I have already begun to make the Legion lose faith. You're not wrong, Night Star. Midnight Lord roared in a long and stern voice, but its content puzzled everyone including Conrad Kaz. You make laws, you punish criminals, Yu reads www.uukangshu.net, you change the system that breeds evil, you bring hope to eternal night, you bring order to chaos, your will and law spread in the sea of stars with the Legion's expedition. There are already dozens of worlds that have fully accepted the rule of the 8th Legion that can prove without doubt that your kindness and fairness are not wrong. You have done everything you promised, and you have not let anyone down. But Nostromo. It's Nostromo who has repeatedly let you down. The act of shouting these words to Gen seemed to drain Ago's Sevitarian strength. The giant in Terminator armor appeared shaky after the words fell, but he managed to stabilize his figure with extraordinary perseverance. In a stunned silence, he changed his Northramo language and said, "You should end this all." The language developed by this eternal night star over a long period of time is filled with a large number of aspirated consonants, making its users sound like some kind of malicious hissing even when speaking normally. In the almost exhausted mouth of Savita, this sentence sounded like a sigh from a dying person. I don't know if it was due to Savita's excessive arrogance or the strong emotions he revealed in this narrative, but after his words fell, the bridge fell silent for a few seconds. Then, Rika Fujimaru broke it with a dry and astringent voice. I'm not sure if I can do it this time, but I'll do my best. What I mean is, Nostromo is not worth the effort you put into it. It's time for you to end all of this. Savita was as angry as a thread, but firm enough, completely. What? You see, almost half of the 8th Legion's fleet is on the track of Nostromo. A platoon leader's voice was tinged with almost equal pain and cruelty, and we even brought whirlwind torpedoes. 3 objections. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The unfulfilled meaning of this sentence stirred up waves on the bridge, and even Tashimaru Rika was shocked by Savita's overly cruel thoughts. She turned around in shock and carefully stared up and down at Savita. During this brief chaos, Conrad Kaz squinted his eyes unhappily. This is not what Yago Sevilla Leon would say. In the midst of a chaotic debate, Toshika Fujimaru cast a puzzled and inquisitive gaze at Conrad Kaz. This was only the third truly meaningful interaction between the two of them after knowing each other, but the latter miraculously understood the former's meaning and shook his head quietly. It wasn't him who asked Savita to say these words. This is indeed his field, a kind of illusion constructed from his memory as the foundation and blueprint, but control is almost completely out of his hands. Although he was able to conceal his body and pass through walls in these illusions, he was unable to make any substantial interference with what happened in the illusions. This illusion was not for his trial, so the true controller of the illusion, the Emperor, did not give him the corresponding authority. But Savita would never say such things on her own. Conrad Kaz knows exactly what kind of person his platoon leader is. Indeed, in the past of reality, when he ordered the burning of Nostromo, it was Savita, as the governor, who pulled the trigger of evil for him. While doing so, that Savita even came up with a set of logic to convince himself, but this does not mean that he himself would make such a judgment without any basis. Although his platoon leader may have some reasonable arrogance in all aspects, he absolutely did not have the arrogance to believe that he was qualified to determine the fate of a parent planet. Besides, that is his home planet. Nostromo may not have left a good impression on him, but Conrad Kaz knew that Savita loved this evil planet from beginning to end. Obviously, Fujimaru Rika is also fully aware of these. After a brief moment of shock, she immediately returned to the crowd and began to stop the chaos in front of her. Everyone indeed stopped and quieted down, but the atmosphere of anxiety and anger still spread in the air. This is not what you would say, Sevilla Leon, said the girl who was temporarily in the primordial position. If you're serious, I want to hear your reasons. Nostromo has committed a crime, General. It has repeatedly ignored your decrees, destroyed your laws, opposed your system, and polluted your legion with fraudsters, scum, and villains. She has committed a crime, and her sins should be punished. Even so, this cannot constitute a reason to destroy the entire planet, Toshika Fujimaru frowned. Not everyone on Nostromo is a criminal, so making the punishment implicate innocent people cannot be considered a just act. There are no innocent people on that planet anymore, said Saivita. Even among the most ordinary people, mothers would be grateful that their sons could stay at home, friends would celebrate that their gang partners were not recruited, and scumbags would happily replace those who should have become Legion soldiers under the operation of the family. This is a crime of the entire society, and everyone is an accomplice. This doesn't seem like something you would say for no reason, Sevilla Leon, Toshimaru Rika suddenly said with great certainty. You must have been influenced by something outside of the Legion lately. No, Gung, I just thought about this issue for a long time. That means you have taken many of our previous conclusions lightly, including our discussion on the size of law enforcement targets and the boundaries of law enforcement behavior, as well as the most important issue of sentencing. Toshika Fujimaru shifted the topic, and Conrad Kaz could see this. I wouldn't do that. And it seems like you need to retake extra lessons, Sevilla Leon. Now is not a good time to have a lengthy discussion, so I suggest you go talk to Sigismund later. Sigismund. What does this matter have to do with the Fist of the Empire? It is not only Conrad Kaz who sees the focus being artificially shifted, but Savita also realizes it. You are shifting the topic, General. I ask you not to do so. And you are persistently fighting for an obviously radical and irrational proposal, Captain Savitarian. Similarly, without applying or obtaining permission, another interstellar warrior present. Perhaps from a standing position, another primordial attendant, but the emblem on his shoulder armor is another symbol that Conrad Kaz has never seen before, perhaps a special position created by Toshika Fujimaru himself. Intercepted Savita's words. It seems that this free speech behavior has already formed a trend in this Midnight Lord Legion meeting. In the subtle pause between the two sentences of this interstellar warrior, Conrad Kaz began to realize that the voice was a bit familiar. The memory of the pathogen is very outstanding, and even if it is physically dead, it has not worn out. He is very certain that he has heard this sound before, but it should not belong to the offspring of his own army. Jen has made a clear rejection and tactful criticism of your suggestion, and you should stop your illegal behavior. At the same time, Conrad Kaz was surprised to realize that this interstellar warrior wearing the armor of the Midnight Lord was actually Sigismund, who belonged to the Imperial Fist in the original history. So far, your foolish behavior has remained within the scope of being solved in the confinement room. If you insist on continuing, I will have to sentence you in accordance with the relevant provisions of the CXXII.4 or CXXIV.2 supplementary regulations in Chapter 3 of the Legion Law. Whatever, you rigid idiot, I don't care, said Saivita, spreading her hand. It is obvious that what he wants to demonstrate with this action is not only his disdainful attitude, but also his hand armor painted red. Anyway, it's not the first time I've led the army, he said. The atmosphere solidified with his generous statement, and for some reason, Sigismund, who had become a Midnight Lord in the illusion, was even reaching out to the hilt of his sword. However, at this moment, Rika Fujimaru extended a hand to stop the impending conflict. It seems that simple opposition won't convince you, Sevilla Leon, she said calmly. It's okay, the night sky is very dark, and Shin needs to spend some more time to complete the task. We can take this opportunity to chat. She looked at Savita standing in front of her for a few seconds before suddenly asking unrelated questions. Do you remember what you did before joining the Legion? This issue clearly exceeded Savita's expectations. He hesitated for a moment, seeming to want to ask something back, but in the end, he replied, at that time, I lived in Kuntas Lair, one of countless gangsters who joined the gang. I did some foolish things such as theft, robbery, and arrogance, and also killed people. Just like any North Ramos with sound limbs and some ability. He paused for a moment and then added, you've always known about this. Yeah, I know, said Toshika Fujimaru. I also know that you are now an interstellar warrior of the Empire, a platoon leader of the Midnight Lord, and one of my most capable siblings. More than 4/5 of the Black Armored Guards and your fellow brothers standing next to you now have similar experiences to yours in their early years. They are also honorable warriors and law enforcement officers worthy of respect. This is just because you specially organized a large number of Northream soldiers for this operation, otherwise this proportion wouldn't be so high. But the focus of the matter is actually not on proportion, but rather on having such people, and there are many of them. Moreover, the Terrans in the Legion were not originally noble individuals with both virtues and virtues. Toshika Fujimaru's calm tone could not hear joy or anger. You know, Sevilla Leon, I have always hoped that you can remember your initial appearance before joining the Legion, when you were still an ordinary person. This is not only to make you remember that you were not born as strong and resolute super warriors, but also to make you look back when you need it, and to see your origin and the traces of your journey. Forgive me for being dull, I don't understand, Jen. Well, strictly speaking, this is a philosophical question that covers a wide range. Let's just talk about the relevant parts of the topic for now. I ask you, Sevitalian, if you could go back in time and tell the one who is still working as a gang thug about your current situation, do you think you would believe everything back then? I think this is a meaningless assumption. Don't be so nervous, just treat it as a casual chat and talk about how your first reaction is. Saivita had already become impatient with this series of irrelevant conversations, but because he was facing his own pathogen, he chose to hide this impatience well. Conrad Kaz can see this. This is first because he is also very familiar with some of the subtle body movements of Yago Severitayan, the platoon leader he is familiar with, and secondly because he is also beginning to feel impatient about it. Unfortunately, he had no right to interfere with this illusion. He could only watch as Savita took a deep breath and continued to answer, I wouldn't believe it. I would also punch someone who dares to entertain me like this with a strong punch in the face and ask him to sell his fantasy fairy tales elsewhere. It's hard to say whether it's because of Savita's wording or because he got a satisfactory result. Toshika Fujimaru smiled lightly as he answered, you see, you know it yourself. Because of the journey you've traveled over the years, you've made earth-shattering changes that you wouldn't even believe. I guess some people standing around you now would have similar feelings if they looked back. Do you want to confirm? No, Yuan, I believe you are right. Saivita's approval came without hesitation. He roughly guessed what the pathogen wanted to illustrate through this example. Yu reading www.yuukangshu.net. This is an indisputable reality, so Sevilla does not intend to make a meaningless struggle on this issue, but to launch an attack from a different perspective. But you are also aware that these changes stem from a very low probability opportunity. The vast majority of Nostromo people do not encounter such an opportunity, and not all those who encounter it are worth it. However, you cannot deny that as long as there is such an opportunity, there are still people who can transform in a better direction. Toshika Fujimaru pointed out, I hope Nostromo can provide equal opportunities for everyone to transform, and for this, I have established order and laws. I admit that I was too naive to believe that most people will yearn for light in the eternal night and will transform in a better direction under order. This has caused me several failures. But as long as this possibility still exists, I will not completely give up this planet. Perhaps people are photogenic, but those on Nostromo are not. This almost made Conrad Kaz laugh out loud. For those insects born in the night and died in the night, light is just like a deadly poison that eats bones. You give them the light, they won't be grateful, they will do everything they can to block those lights again, let the environment return to the darkness they are more familiar with, more accustomed to, and more fond of, deceive themselves that all of this is no different from before, and then continue to be so drunk and dreamy. No matter how you try, you will find that they have an amazing mind and adaptability in this matter, like a virus that is difficult to kill. The only way to end this is to destroy the entire planet. Just like Conrad Kaz did before. Midnight Ghost was so determined that Nostromo had no future in his eyes. Then he quickly realized that Fujimaru Rika, who had already failed several times on this issue, still did not think so. For rejections. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. You are doing something impossible, Gen. Saivita's voice echoed back in the bridge. I don't intend to comment too much on this, but I still insist on my original viewpoint. There are too many things in the world that were originally thought impossible, and there is more than just one impossible thing I have accomplished. Toshika Fujimaru has already set a hidden line against this doubt. Don't be trapped by common sense. When you were on Nostromo, didn't you still feel that you couldn't be the person you are today? Saivita was caught off guard by his previous statement, but Estat's quick thinking led him to find a new direction of attack in an instant. Nostromo has brought too many problems, and for the Legion, she can almost be said to be just a negative asset. For the sake of expedition efficiency, it is wise to deal with as soon as possible. At this moment, Fujimaru Rika revealed a strange sadness. That would be too pitiful. She didn't say anything pitiful, nor did she give anyone else a chance to ask. After a brief pause, she resumed the conversation with a firm determination, but you're right, Sevilla Leon. Nostromo is a Legion asset, and when she has problems, she should solve them in the Legion's way. I should have done it long ago. She started pacing anxiously in the tiny inch of the center of the field, whispering in a light and fast Northramo dialect, I've been away for too long, and as you often complain, I'm too kind. I'm afraid those idiots on the ground have already forgotten that I wasn't elected to power through appeasement, lobbying, or loose laws. Pure high-pressure rule will cause backlash, but now it seems reasonable policies in other worlds will only make short-sighted nobles forget. They must remember that I'm also Northramo. No, or maybe even the entire class. A restless atmosphere began to drift away with the gentle hissing unique to Nostromo language, as if it was just a breath. Toshimaru Rika suddenly showed some abnormal neuroticism. Some muscles were spasming abnormally, tearing at her face and rationality, and her frowning eyebrows showed anxiety, irritability, and an unknown source of anger. She turned her back again to the majority of the crowd, trying to prevent the midnight offspring from seeing her tormented by sudden symptoms. She straightened her body and grabbed a railing at her hand. This may seem a bit inexplicable, but Conrad Kaz knew from the first moment what was going on. After all, almost his entire life was tormented and played with by this uncontrollable curse. An omen. There is no reason, no hint, just a bald, almost overwhelming, overly real omen. This piqued Conrad Kaz's interest. In fact, everything he has seen on this ship so far has piqued his interest. Even though he clearly dislikes some of what he has seen and disdains the rest, he still has to admit that he is very interested in what will happen next. He still remembers his original intention. He wanted to know where he had lost. From the moment he arrived on this night ship, he began to observe and gather various types of intelligence. Conrad Kaz has always been very sensitive, and such things are not difficult for him. He is not familiar with Toshio Fujimaru. They only talked to each other a few times at the beginning of this trial, but now he has roughly pieced together the image of Toshio Fujimaru from the nightfall itself and everything that happened just now. So far, he does not think there is any decisive special about each other. So it could only be this one. Conrad Kaz carefully stared at Rika Fujimaru during the prophecy, analyzing every spasm of her body and every whisper she uttered in delirium. How would she deal with this confusing curse? Conrad Kaz is really curious about this, but the struggle that occurs in the realm of other people's consciousness cannot be seen from the surface. Even though he was a pathogen, in the current situation, he could only see a common silence permeating the midnight offspring. Smelling the worries and anxieties that slowly drifted out of this silence, he realized that Sigismund had quietly moved himself between his original body and other Legion soldiers, watching as Fujimaru Rika, who was dragging the railing, slowly knelt on the high platform under the torment of prophecy. Yes, she stood on a small, movable platform from the beginning, which is why she had a guardrail at hand. Otherwise, with her pitiful height of only 5 feet and 2 inches, she would only have been buried and invisible among a group of estates. In fact, after she slowly knelt down in the torment of prophecy, this scene had already come true. But this ridiculous scene didn't last long. A trembling sigh from Rika Fujimaru shattered the unsettling silence in the bridge 1 minute and 20.4 seconds later. How long has it been this time? She let go of the pitiful railing that had been deformed by the power that belonged to her, but not to her, and weakly asked the air. Immediately afterwards, Sigismund reported the exact time behind her. But I feel like at least 3 hours have passed, Toshio Fujimaru said with a bitter smile. Some ordinary servants who were originally wandering around the periphery gathered together, carrying towels and warm water to tidy up the appearance of the commander of the 8th Army, who was sweating profusely. At the same time, a subtle doubt flashed through Konrad Kaza's mind. The symptoms were too mild compared to when he had a seizure himself. When he struggled in those terrible illusions that foreshadowed the future, he always needed to clear everyone in the room except himself, and then spent several hours floating and sinking in those crazy scenes. When he finally woke up, he would always find that he had unconsciously made everything around him look like a typhoon passing by. That's why he had to be alone during the attack. Not only does the pride of the pathogen demand that he do so, but also because otherwise, he will become a murderer without realizing it. And similar things have indeed happened, perhaps becoming the last straw to overwhelm the camel. Konrad Kaz forcefully pulled his scattered thoughts back to the present situation. He didn't know if it was the Emperor who built this illusion blowing a black whistle on the mortal girl, or if she did have some other technique to deal with the prophecy illusion herself. Before he could come up with a solution to the obvious inadequacy of this clue, the servants had already dispersed, and Fujimaru Rika stood up again, almost recovering from those cruel prophecies. "What did you see this time?" Sigismund asked softly. "This is not strange." Konrad Kaz thought coldly. Many people who cannot see the future have unrealistic fantasies about it. In the past, every time he broke free from those despairing and terrifying illusions, his Savita also liked to ask him similar questions. As usual. Toshika Fujimaru also seemed accustomed to being asked similar things after each episode, and she may have answered the same question many times. The destruction of Nostromo, the burning Milky Way, and some things that can be considered blasphemous just by saying them. There's nothing particularly new. Perhaps at other times, Midnight's offspring would catch some other key words from Fujimaru Rika's vague summary, but at this moment, Savita just softly repeated the least important short sentence. "You see the destruction of Nostromo." This is not the first time, Toshika Fujimaru admitted calmly, but that is something that may happen in the future. Now, Nostromo is still fine. But your prophecies are always accurate, no matter how bad they may be. Savita wore his helmet throughout the conversation, but Konrad Kaz could still smell some desperate determination that was covered up by his efforts. If Nostromo is destined to be destroyed, why not let us sinners judge this planet that is constantly breeding evil? Ah! That's why Shen is my ceremonial officer, Sigismund is my criminal officer, and you can only be my platoon leader, Sevitarian. Toshima Reika sighed lightly, sometimes you're a bit too result-oriented. In that moment, Konrad Kaz was certain that Savita's intention to show off was faster than his brain controlling his mouth. But you 6 Terra standards said you liked me a while ago. This is a euphemistic way of speaking. And don't take what you say out of context from the situation itself. The commander of the 8th Army intimidated and slammed the railing at hand, but the uncontrollable bit of madness in her tone made the whole atmosphere less serious. You are the kind of person who works hard towards a result without hesitation when you see it. Of course, this is great in normal times. You can make a clear judgment of the current situation and find a suitable solution. But the results you can foresee on your own are within your reach, and prophecies are not such a thing. The outcome in the prophecy may happen tomorrow, or it may happen 1,000 years later, or it may not happen at all. no one can say for sure. Not necessarily. For a moment, Conrad Kaz wanted to refute this based on his own personal experience, but in the following moment, he felt that Toshio Fujimaru's words seemed not to be wrong. The illusions that were poured into his mind regardless of his own wishes were not very reasonable, and sometimes he could see many different possibilities. Although he always stubbornly chose to believe in the worst, and even after the emperor pointed this out, he refused to admit that it was a mistake. But, pathogen, if we could have known in advance about that result. Even if I could know the outcome of the future, it wouldn't be so bad. I wouldn't still be living in the present like you all do. Toshika Fujimaru finally began to feel a bit impatient. I have to take a bite of food, walk step by step, and live day by day. It's not like I'm foreseeing the destruction of Nostromo right now, so we can just skip the time to the moment of her destruction. And there's no such thing as using wartime supplies or troop transport vehicles in this topic. Conrad Kaz spent some time slandering Rika Fujimaru's last words, which shattered the supposed serious atmosphere. Yu read www.yuyukeangshu.net until he realized that Savita was really showing a look like she had something she wanted to say but was blocked back. In some of Gudazi's languages, the future can be written directly as not yet, and not yet things should obviously not squeeze out the urgent issues that need to be solved in the present for the vast majority of the time, becoming the highest priority at present, because it is precisely because the bits and pieces of the present come together that humanity can reach the future. Fujimaru Rika's words carry a strong belief. To put it plainly, my creed is: it is more important to live each day with a down-to-earth attitude than to worry about things that have not yet taken effect. And when it comes to Nostromo's disposal, please understand it as even if tomorrow is the planet. Just because of some force majeure, she was blown to pieces. Today, I will also try to make her even a little better. Have I successfully expressed my attitude? Her tone was not very strong, and could even be considered polite, but Sevilla did back down before the announcement. At midnight, a platoon leader of the Lord clearly expressed obedience through body language, while at the same time, Sigismund stepped forward and his step forward froze in mid-air. The time in the illusion freezes here, everything is silent, and all the data has made way for their true owners. Conrad Kaz, the master of the field, spoke here. Ordinary people's thoughts. He spoke of the creed of Fujimaru Rika's serious statement, and the latter even smiled at him. I am just an ordinary person. She spoke softly in a calm and composed tone, yet with a slight hint of pride. 5 Conversations. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Perhaps so, Conrad Kaz showed a strange and ambiguous attitude towards this physical reality. You are trying to blur the objective facts. Toshika Fujimaru lifted her arms and looked up at him fearlessly. Although from my personal perspective, I am not very concerned about how others see me in detail, given some other objective situations that actually exist, I think it's best for me to emphasize that I am an average human in all aspects, and in your context, there is no doubt that I am a mortal. Conrad Kaz really wants to refute, after all, this ordinary person's overly magnificent life has just caused him 3 setbacks. He had already prepared many satires and rebuttals for this, with at least 300 examples to provide evidence, but he didn't need any foresight to feel that if he wanted to engage in a debate with the other party on this topic, their conversation would become endless. So he simply didn't react to this and complained softly about the topic he wanted to discuss. I was originally looking for an answer, but my father, who was too fond of hints and metaphors, just threw me and my questions into such a scene. Fujimaru Rika was well behaved and didn't dwell too much on the previous topic. She followed his instructions and asked, so did you find the answer in this scene? No, Conrad Kaz said with a hint of annoyance, your legion is very different from mine. The people I used to know have also become somewhat different under your command, but I haven't seen anything decisive. What do you mean by something decisive? The reason that made Nostromo better, the reason that made you decide to let go of this nest of sins and not bring it to trial, the reason that kept you rational in the face of the foreseeable future. After his words fell, Fujimaru Rika shrugged dejectedly. First of all, I didn't make Nostradamus better. She was obviously not in a high mood about this, but she still stepped down from the small platform used as a stepping stone, drilled out the human wall enclosed by Asta, which was too tall for her, and walked to the huge French window on the edge of the bridge. This field is built on your basis. So even on the track, you should be able to directly inspect everything on the surface of Nostradamus. No matter how hard I tried, the crime rate in the city just kept going up and down. Recently, it is obviously an ugly period. Conrad Kaz followed in her footsteps, overlooking the forever dark planet from the night shuttle in the void. The time in the illusion was frozen, but as Rika Fujimaru said, as long as he had this idea, everything that had happened recently on Nostromo automatically unfolded before his eyes. This feels a bit strange. A large amount of intelligence poured into the true pathogen's mind, forming an illusion similar to his accustomed prophecy, but more gentle and controllable. If the feeling brought by squeezing those prophecies into Conrad Kaz's mind is likened to splashing water into a boiling oil pot, then these, already happened, scenes surge in like dripping water into a sink. It cannot be said that it has no impact on the mind when it occurs, but in the eyes of Conrad Kaz, who is accustomed to the former, it is easy and enjoyable to ignore this seemingly intangible touch. The brain of the pathogen began to interpret those towering images in a rare and comfortable working environment. He saw every conspiracy, every violence, every theft, every slaughter in Nostromo. He saw the workers numbly falling in the slums, the panicked employees in the streets, the sheriff who tried in vain to maintain order but was drowned by the thugs, and the nobles drinking the fine wine brewed by sin on the magnificent dance floor of the upper nest. He saw Nostromo. A slightly different detail from the original, but fundamentally, it is still the infamous and hopeless Nostromo he is familiar with in the mud. I've tried a few times, but she always changes back to this way. Toshika Fujimaru stood beside him, meaninglessly circling the only planet in front of them, adorned with lights, on the transparent material in front of them in the pitch-black sky. Judging by the standards of a pathogen, would undoubtedly be very unsuccessful. I couldn't even make my home planet last forever. It's not that no one has said it's not my problem, but I understand. To her surprise, Conrad Kaz's voice carried a sense of relief. Nostromo is like this. Rotten wood is hard to carve. Well, it's not that absolute. At least that's how I feel. Toshika Fujimaru said slowly, that's why I still have hope for this planet. I've seen something even more disgusting and hopeless. Unlike the British Strange Belt, the people of Nostromo are still humans, and most of Nostromo's problems are due to the harsh environment rather than human nature. As long as this too negative environmental problem can be corrected, Queen Morgan can turn Britain into a fairy tale-like country, so Nostromo has not improved much. Perhaps it's because I haven't worked hard enough or found the right way. If it were usual, Conrad Kaz would naturally freely spread some opinions on the topic of human nature. But he extracted even more surprising keywords from these brief sentences. Is there anywhere else that can be more hopeless than Nostromo? Fujimaru Rika looked up at him in confusion and said, simply put, it's a kingdom established by fairies destined for destruction. Haven't you seen it in my illusion? Conrad Kaz wants to say no. He only had to be defeated by King Solomon's 70.2 demon pillars after arriving at the Temple of Time. But the pride that belonged to the pathogen forced him to close his lips tightly, and with a hint of anger, he suddenly turned back and stared at the distant Sin Star again. Perhaps he should have asked in detail, but in the end, he still didn't. He really can't construct an appropriate imagination through that simple sentence. Perhaps it's because he never thought there was anything worse than Nostromo's illness. Toshika Fujimaru may have realized something about it, but she just assumed nothing had happened and continued to talk about trivial topics around him, mostly about her plans for Nostromo's future, while Conrad Kaz allowed herself to immerse herself in boundless thinking. Although it is a simple matter for Yuan to focus on dual purposes, he is indeed listening to governance methods such as military control under the direct jurisdiction of the Eighth Army, cleansing of the upper nest aristocracy, how to maintain basic education and medical operations, and how to select a new governor. In his opinion, these methods are still too lenient, but he is really reluctant to give even the most basic response to this. Fortunately, the speakers seem to only want to express these words without asking for a response or seeking advice, so this hot one-sided speech still successfully reached its conclusion. In short, if this move doesn't work, I really need to seriously consider the plan of population cleansing, said Toshika Fujimaru in a sorrowful conclusion. Sometimes I really feel like Sisyphus, but being able to predict the future in such times is also a good thing. At least I roughly understand that this matter, whether good or bad, always has an end. So you actually believe in that future, Conrad Kaz said somewhat puzzled. Nostromo will one day fall apart and cease to exist under the impact of orbital bombing. Isn't this strange? Don't you also believe that the bad future you see in the illusion will surely come, said Toshika Fujimaru, who heard the emotions in the sentence. After hearing your bold words of down to earth, I thought you would forget them and just focus on the things in front of you. Perhaps compared to you real pathogens, I do appear short-sighted, but that's not why you roundly criticize me for being foolish. Fujimaru Toshio accused with a strong aroma, are your own strategies for dealing with prophecies very wise? This sentence may indeed have touched the mold. Before any sound could be heard, the atmosphere around seemed to be shrouded in a murderous aura. Conrad Kaz grinned softly in such an atmosphere, and the Nostromo language in his mouth was like a venomous snake spitting out a message. I dare not, please do not hesitate to teach me. If you can really say something to teach me a lesson. The anger of a pathogen is difficult to bear, even if it is only the intangible part. In this frozen illusion, the air and light seemed to be twisted by Conrad Kaz's anger, but Toshimaru Rika remained as calm and fearless as if nothing had happened. Then he continued his conversation. I can't talk about lessons, what can I teach you as an ordinary person? I'm just using my methodology to understand and deal with the future I see. But have you ever thought about how this prophecy works fundamentally? Conrad Kaz was stopped. Throughout his life, he did not think about this issue. For him, prophecy is an innate instinct. Just like breathing is a human instinct, a natural talent, and the vast majority of humans do not bother to study why breathing can sustain life. The curse that haunted Conrad Kaz throughout his life was also similar to him. Without waiting for the other party's response, Toshika Fujimaru continued on her own, for me, this is an acquired, abnormal, function, so I have studied it. To put it simply, the essence of this prediction is a fitting deduction of subspace big data. After calculating in the black box of the primordial brain, Yu reads a book www.yuukangshu.net to output the most likely result of a predicted future view. Although the world here is different from where I used to be, the boundary between prediction and measurement is very blurry. But in short, all the conclusions it outputs are based on your psychic abilities. It is absolutely true that the essence lies in the intelligence data collected through unintentional communication with the subspace. Conrad Kaz can understand what she's saying, but he doesn't understand what this has to do with their current topic. So what if we know about this? This indicates that this seemingly extremely accurate prediction may also be interfered with. Although this possibility is negligible from the perspective of actual use, there is indeed a possibility that the output results may be incorrect due to contamination of the original data. Furthermore, it provides an unverified idea that interfering with reality by means that cannot generate projection in subspace may change the prediction. Rika Fujimaru's volume gradually decreased under Conrad Kaz's gaze, feeling guilty. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh. Okay, I admit that knowing this operating mechanism is completely useless in practical use. After all, you don't need to understand how explosives are produced to be able to fire an explosive gun. But this does prove that this prophecy is not completely flawless. At least in the face of those bad omens, there is still hope of struggling. Conrad Kaz was almost amused by this overly naive assumption. Have you ever succeeded in your struggle? Can you pick up any pot that doesn't open, Mr. Conrad? Fujimaru Rika showed a hint of anger and frustration. This illusion is completely set up in a subspace. Where do you want me to find something or means that says there is no subspace projection for experimental testing? 6 Future. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. So you spent your time doing something meaningless. Perhaps it was because Rika Fujimaru had made some progress on this issue. Conrad Kaz's anger had subsided slightly, but he still sharply mocked it with a dark and gloomy mood. Travelers heading in the wrong direction will never reach the right endpoint, let alone you are heading towards a definite dead end. I can't see the meaning of wasting your energy on these unnecessary things. Also including me trying to change Nostromo. Otherwise, what do you think I'm referring to? Accusing you of making Nightfall sound like a capital of classical music. The true lord of the 8th Legion let out a monster-like scream in this sentence. I do have something to say about this. The 8th Legion should be the hammer of justice, the blade of punishment, and the scapegoat of spreading fear. And you make them weak. Faced with criticism from a pathogen, especially from Conrad Kaz, Rika Fujimaru still did not show any fear. The only emotive gesture she revealed about this was a helpless sigh. It seems that we have disagreements on many things. If things develop as planned by the Emperor, we may have to work together for a while. Conrad Kaz knew what this plan was and was not optimistic about it from the beginning, but even though he had received a definite judgment and death in Tagusa, he realized that the instincts of his life were still deeply ingrained in him, lacking material support, before being awakened by the Emperor and entering the illusion. He saw that the plan would proceed smoothly to the end, and then it would succeed. That's also why, even though he had 10,000 unwillingness, he still almost obediently passed the trial according to the arrangement of the illusion. That's also why, even though Fujimaru Rika did make him angry on many levels, this girl was still able to stand still and talk to him with all her hair and tail. She occupies a more important part of this destined success plan, even more so than Conrad Coates. So she must live. Let's first address the initial topic. You think many of my attempts are meaningless because they cannot change the predetermined outcome. Is that so, Mr. Conrad? Indeed. Conrad Kaz, although somewhat critical of many issues related to her, still agrees with Rika Fujimaru's ability to quickly grasp the key points in conversations. However, the identification that appeared at this moment only intensified the disgust and annoyance that had been lingering in his heart since he boarded this Nightfall, making him feel that his disgust towards the whole thing was not pure enough. And, don't try to convince me with the persuasive tactics of the competition, the awakened dead soul added with clear malice. Fujimaru Rika shook her head slightly and said, I didn't convince Sevilla Leon. I just temporarily suppressed some of his ideas that didn't suit my heart through my position as the commander of the 8th Army. You should also be aware that Sevilla Leon can be said to be very stubborn. Or rather, Astad is basically very stubborn. It always takes a lot of time and reliable examples to completely persuade them to change their minds. So you will soon find that the pathogen is much more stubborn than Astad. I am also much more proud. In fact, I have already discovered this from the imperial history presented to me by the Emperor and my contact with Mr. Ferris. But considering that we have all experienced many terrible prophecy illusions here and now, I think maybe our communication on the topic of the future will be smoother. Conrad Kaz is non-committal. Even though he had a lot of mockery in his heart, he still made a "please continue" gesture on the surface. He made up his mind to see what the high opinion was about this mortal, who, according to the basic setting of this illusion, witnessed every prophecy he had seen at this point in his life, but still did not suffer a mental breakdown as a result. First of all, I don't think it's pointless to make changes even if the outcome of something is certain. Toshika Fujimaru turned her head and turned her gaze back to Nostromo in the lonely void. Many times, the impact of something on the future is not just about the outcome. Like this planet that always twists and turns back to its original point. Perhaps it will always return to this chaotic and sinful state, but in the decade when each change began, order and peace could still operate, there were still people who benefited from it. The thoughts of mortals. Conrad Kaz was about to burst out laughing. What does this represent? Does a small achievement bring you self-comfort? How can this be considered self-comfort? Isn't even a trivial achievement considered an achievement? Fujimaru Rika refuted with a similar sentence structure. On the original Nostromo, those who could only die of cold and hunger received appropriate relief, those who could only be worn to death on the assembly line received legitimate rewards and holidays, those who could only be used as weapons and cannon fodder for the nobility received other more valuable ways out, and those who could only be illiterate for a lifetime received education and promotion stairs. Even if such an order could only operate for a short period of 10 years each time, are these not gratifying changes? I understand that you, Gen, and even Estat, don't care much about the general public. During the Great Expedition, your gaze fell on the stars, your fleet swept across countless planets, slaughtered countless aliens, and pointed to a brilliant future, a future imposed on oneself. But dare you say that you have never longed for such a future at all? Fujimaru Rika even turned around and roared at him, while Conrad Kaz was indeed asked for a moment. He did not answer this question, but the act of not answering is itself an answer. That is a future that depicts the happiness of all humanity. After stabilizing her emotions a little, Fujimaru Rika's tone changed to a soft whisper, and human happiness sprouts from these things that you don't care about. But it's no use. Conrad Kaz also replied in a similar low voice. You also know that these things are illusory foam that can only last for more than 10 years on North Tramo. They may look beautiful, but they will eventually fall back into the quagmire filled with deadly chemicals after being broken. The foam may eventually break, but the foam did exist. Fujimaru said, people who clearly distinguish between right and wrong and have a sense of justice are growing in these waves of reincarnation. When the number of these people is increasing, chaos will have to pay more price to replace order, until it can no longer form a climate. I have data to prove this. Naive. Conrad Kaz thought so. But he began to find it difficult to define whether this approach was ridiculous or respectable. Perhaps so, but how long will it take? He was a bit surprised to find that his questioning no longer carried such obvious malice and hostility. Did the future of Haiqing and Heian that you expected come first? Or did the end of Nostromo come first? Didn't your prophecy tell you? I don't quite understand your view on those prophecies, Mr. Conrad, sighed Toshika Fujimaru. In my opinion, you were completely trapped by them in your life, but I managed to escape because I was on guard from the beginning. As someone who wasn't in prison, my answer to this is, I don't care. The shock this answer brought to Conrad Kaz was far greater than the indignation caused by the rejection of his ideas by a mortal. Even if it was the pathogen, he could only unconsciously repeat the other person's answer in surprise. It doesn't matter. If the future of Haiqing and Heian comes first, that would be great, but if the end of Nostromo comes first, does it mean that my transformation of Nostromo has to come to an end? Fujimaru Rika confidently said what seemed illogical to Conrad Kaz. I want to change Nostromo, that's right, but what I actually want to change is not the planet itself, but the people on the planet. With humanity's technological level in the 30th millennium, moving the entire planet's people to live on another planet is not impossible. If Nostromo's destruction cannot be stopped, then let it be destroyed. As a genetic pathogen, of course, I can pack all the residents of my home planet and take them away to another livable planet, rebuild a consistent culture and architecture, and continue to transform its social environment. Conrad Kaz was so surprised that he couldn't speak. Although he never thought about solving this problem, he was still intimidated by the shocking logic that emerged to solve the problem. He couldn't react, while Fujimaru Rika's speech continued. At the end of the day, although we can see the outcome of something in the future, this outcome itself is only a temporary summary and conclusion of the future, not an actual end. Nostromo may be destroyed, and if she is really shattered in orbital bombing, her wreckage will still drift in this galaxy. Mechanical ships can still salvage the precious gold ore that originally belonged to Nostromo nearby. In my opinion, further speaking, the galaxy may be ignited by war, and Horus may drag the entire empire into the quagmire of war. If this is bound to happen, then the most important thing to do is to hoard enough in advance. Is there a quantity of fire extinguishers, and is there a way to tie a rope and pull her out when the empire slides into the swamp? That little bit of effort is like a praying mantis wielding a chariot. In the midst of the flames of war, what is the use of just one legion? Effort may not yield results, but effort itself can also produce meaning. Even if it is small. She has already talked about this topic before, but Fujimaru Rika doesn't seem to mind repeating it again. Without a small step, one cannot reach 1,000 miles, without a small stream, one cannot become a river and sea. I believe that even if one's efforts today cannot achieve results, even if the results are scattered in a dangerous reality, they will inevitably become the cornerstone of a different future. But how do you know if that unforeseeable future is good or bad? If it's a good future, accept it. If it's a bad future, work hard to correct or overcome it. When Fujimaru Rika said these words, she was like a child playing a prank in a game and trying to win no matter what. I don't believe in fate. After the words fell, Conrad Kaz pondered for a few minutes. For the pathogen, these few minutes are enough for him to engage in quite complex thinking and process data that is difficult for ordinary people to understand. Fujimaru Rika was not sure what he had been thinking during this period, but she clearly had sufficient patience and just stood quietly on the side, waiting for the other party's thinking to come to a conclusion. Finally, the pathogen of the 8th Legion unexpectedly revealed a smile that contained only positive meaning. Fujimaru Rika, you did teach me a lesson. He was not very satisfied, but he decided to admit, I may need some time to think about all the points you raised in this conversation. Before I come to a conclusion, I will have reservations about them. But only on the last point, I can agree immediately and unconditionally. He smiled awkwardly and said, if you believe in fate, you might have died 10,000 times before. Who said it's not? Fujimaru Rika deliberately blinked at him. The previously tense atmosphere dissipated, and together they revealed a silent smile on the bridge of the Nightfall ship in the almost devoid light. 7 Contracts. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After the atmosphere became more harmonious, the annoying parts of the entire plan seemed to be easier to accept. I guess the organizer of this trial allowed us to meet, which is probably a signal that the trial can be over. Conrad Kaz took the initiative to mention, we can proceed to the next step of the plan. Although I don't have a good impression of my impulsive father's decision to bind me to another person with some kind of spell, but if that other person is you, it doesn't seem unbearable. Fujimaru Rika shrugged nonchalantly and said, let's talk about the issue of this contract first. This thing, at least in the initial planning stage, is still necessary. May I hear its details? Everyone crawled out of Nostromo and had a certain level of psychological resilience, so I have something to say. Do you remember you're already dead? Impressed deeply. After 10,000 years in the material world, even the remains of the pathogen will decay over time. It is understandable that there is probably nothing left now, right? Conrad Kaz casually signaled the other person to continue speaking. Under the above premise, as a complete subspace creature with only soul and essence left, where does your body come from when you want to walk through the curtain in reality? You can't rely on bloody sacrifices every time like those chaotic demons to pile it up for you, can you? Faced with the natural gaze of Rika Fujimaru, Conrad Kaz hesitated suspiciously for 2 seconds and silently averted his gaze. Why do you really think so? The Empire is very large, and you can easily screen out countless criminals on any planet. The deceased Genji understood from the beginning that Toshio Fujimaru strongly opposed this view, but did not understand the specific source of this view, and even did not feel that his thinking was wrong. If the situation is urgent and cannot be sacrificed in time, seizing a body that is not very suitable temporarily can also be an alternative solution, as long as you carefully choose a really damn target. Fujimaru Rika took a deep breath and covered her face in pain. We need to find a big time to talk about this issue, about legal and procedural justice, she said in a muffled voice behind her palm, but I thought you were a bit of a cleanliness freak. You don't care about this behavior that's almost indistinguishable from cannibalism. Conrad Kaz smiled bitterly and said, "Didn't the one on the throne tell you? I even carved a statue of my father from the flesh and blood of a dead person, and he himself spoke to me through that statue. He didn't really mention this matter to explain anything, just to scare this seemingly underage ordinary girl. Unfortunately, this girl, who is not as ordinary as the vast majority of ordinary people and may not be considered a little girl at her true age, has already gone through the stage of being scared by simple bloody horror stories. Her reaction to this was only to sigh longer and louder, then take off her hands and show a serious expression. We also need to talk about this, including things like you and your legion hanging corpses and human skin as decorations everywhere. She said, although telling you that we shouldn't desecrate corpses or anything like that is most likely just casting pearls before swine, I don't want to talk too much about your artistic tradition, but at least we should pay attention to hygiene issues, right? Conrad Kaz began to feel that if there had to be a contract between him and this little girl, his days would not be boring anymore. Toshika Fujimaru waved her hand with annoyance, as if this could drive away the topic she disliked so much. In short, returning to the original theme. This contract, that was modified on the original system, is to solve the problem that you currently do not have a body that can walk in the physical world. The fact is not entirely so, but for the sake of convenience, I summarized it in this minimalist version. I can directly use ether to weave a material form that is almost the same as the original one in reality, and the contract between you and me ensures that it is indeed you who use this form, not any other cat or dog in the subspace. After pausing for a moment and confirming that the other party had no questions, Toshika Fujimaru continued to add, of course, the contract itself has many other functions, but you can just treat it as a property certificate for now. If you don't like it, just wait until we all leave the subspace before dissolving it. Besides, haven't you already maintained a contract with tens of thousands of people? Conrad Kaz frowned and said, I don't have that kind of impression. Even if you don't mention my illusion, you still have your legion. Toshika Fujimaru waved her hand intently towards the direction where the interstellar warriors were gathered on the inner side of the bridge. Don't you realize that the estat transformation surgery can also be seen as a process of reaching a base contract with the pathogen? She paused for a moment, carefully observed Conrad Kaz's expression, and then concluded with certainty, okay, you didn't realize it. So this base contract. I'm starting to regret using this as an example. I'm not good at explaining these concepts in magic at all. After feeling discouraged for a while, Toshimaru Rika forcefully explained these concepts. In fact, the estat modification surgery itself has already fully embodied the concept of the base contract. A stat will enter into a contract with the pathogen that provides genes at the genetic level, and in this process, undergo a transformation, randomly inheriting some abilities or traits from the pathogen, and instinctively speaking, it is difficult to bring up the idea of resisting one's own pathogen. The most important thing is that once the base contract is established, it cannot be terminated. The base contract imposed by a hierarchical existence like Tiamat can even completely change the way the receptor thinks from the underlying logic, erasing its original thinking. Personality, in order to achieve complete control over receptors. But estat surgery is not so scary yet. Conrad Kaz nodded and asked, the contract that the Emperor intends to establish between you and me. That's just a relatively ordinary magic contract, modified using the Chaldean spirit summoning system. Fujimaru Rika shrugged, it doesn't involve genes, it doesn't involve souls, and there's no particularly clear master-slave relationship. It's just a simple channel, in the sense of magic built between you and me as a bond, which may or may not share some of the opponent's abilities. There's no particularly troublesome ceremony, and if you want to release it, it can be released at any time. After being released, if you regret it, it's not impossible to disconnect and reconnect at any time. This kind of thing should be convenient to use even in emergency situations. The other party who is about to be contracted will not comment on this. Do you seem uninterested in this matter? Fujimaru Rika took a few steps around the genitalia, who had turned her head, and tried to look at each other again. I feel like we all have a lot of contracts, so there isn't much more between us. But if you're really annoyed by this, I promise to untie it when we solve the problem with the body. If you feel uneasy, I can also swear to you with my soul in a magical sense. That's not the problem. Conrad Kaz reached out his hand and easily pulled her back to her original position. Just do what you need to do according to the plan. You've done it very well, but in that big plan, you have your tasks and I have mine. We're just working together temporarily, there's no need to make our relationship too good. He said with such a lackluster mood, and immediately released control over his own field. At the moment when the time of illusion began to flow again, Conrad Kaz's figure also broke up like a foam and dissipated invisibly. He left from the illusion. Although in the eyes of Toshio Fujimaru, it was Conrad Kaz who disappeared from the nightfall in the mirage, but from the latter's perspective, everything around him rapidly cracks and shatters, along with his own tangible entity in the illusion merging into golden gravel-like dots of light, flowing towards the vast surrounding space. Time and space in subspace have no meaning. Although their entire plan clearly had a clear timeline, whether in the words of Toshio Fujimaru or in the Emperor's plan, before leaving the subspace, those things were nothing but empty talk and waste paper. Therefore, Conrad Kaz was unable to accurately locate his time and space, and even the pathogen could only describe his current state in a rather imprecise way in such a situation. He was situated in a space entirely composed of golden light, which was boundless no matter which direction he looked at, without even being able to distinguish between top and bottom, belonging to the Emperor. He himself was also in an indescribable state of soul, with the ends of his limbs constantly deforming uncontrollably like some viscous black fluid, which always made him feel quite annoyed. But in this shining place, what annoyed him the most was the shining golden Ferrus Manus in front of him. The form of Ferrus Manus, who also exists as a soul or subspace creature, appears much more stable than that of Conrad Kaz. The latter is not very eager to carefully consider the reasons, and is also lazy to pretend to be brotherly and respectful to the other party. They had nothing to say during their lifetime, and this did not change after death. Even those sarcastic remarks were exhausted in the last conversation. It was the kind of conversation where, without the power of the Emperor, the dead pathogen would die again. Have you made a decision yet? Ferrus Manus asked in a rather blunt manner. Is there any room for me to make a decision in this whole matter? Conrad Kaz sneered, my sins are unforgivable, and death should be my only and ultimate destination. But our Father always disregards our wishes and does what he thinks is right. I don't deserve a second life. I have said it many times, do you think he has ever heard of it? This is also the reason why he suddenly appeared disinterested at the end of the illusion. Conrad Kaz once again realized clearly that he was just a monster hiding in the darkness, and Rika Fujimaru, Father must have his reasons for choosing you in this matter. Before he could successfully define Fujimaru Rika as someone, Ferrus Manus mechanically repeated this viewpoint he had already repeated 56 times before, interrupting Conrad Kaz's train of thought. Perhaps we still can't understand. But in my opinion, the reason he woke me up from the sweet death was simply because you refused to go. The 8th Legion, who was proficient in almost all uncomfortable means, casually, or deliberately, lifted his brother's fig leaf. Unlike me, you have long been a member of the Cursed Legion and have the right to occasionally step into reality. But why has your miracle never been passed down in your offspring for 10,000 years? Conrad Kaz stubbornly mocked, almost like a proud child, aren't you worried about having a physical form and not being able to hide from your offspring? There's no need to think so clearly about things in Baya Space. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Sometimes, it's hard to say which thing made Fujimaru Rika feel more exhausted. Whether she spent 100 years in a fantasy world governing a rotten planet, leading a legion to conquer the Milky Way, and being solidly killed once in the final rebellion, or realizing again that the psychological age of the original organism is generally not more than 5 years old. Not to mention anything else, the Konrad Kaz and Ferris Manus in front of us are very good examples. Two gentlemen. Although this environment, which has nothing but golden light and can't even distinguish between top, bottom, left, and right, does it lack some reference points? Do you think I can't tell where the typhoon just passed here? Fujimaru Rika supported her forehead and said, also, the last time I came here, I made some basic furniture for this place. Even if no one wanted to use it, it would be good to use it to indicate the specific direction. Where have those things gone now? What kind of typhoon is passing through? We just had some friendly exchanges that brothers should have had after a long separation and reunion, and didn't do anything out of line. Konrad Kaz, who was originally unstable in form and was now about to lose his profile under the attack of his opponent, turned into a black sticky mass, and laughed casually as he argued. He became accustomed to being a villain in the final stage of his life, so in a sense, he has set his bottom line very low now, and this performance is not surprising. However, when Ferris Manus, who was originally angry but still seemed imposing, heard the latter question, his face, which was entirely composed of the golden flames of imperial spiritual power, suddenly showed a little awkwardness. Father took them away when he came to inspect last time. Ferris selectively answered the second question directly. Using psychic creations out of thin air is a very rare spell, and he wants to know how you did it. Fujimaru Rika stared at these two pathogens. Or visually, the two somewhat elusive shadows. For a few seconds before finally deciding that it was for the sake of her own mental health, and in the need for mental rest, it was better not to investigate why they had started fighting again for the time being. As the only person present who possesses a material entity and can return to the real world at any time with this idea, she believes it is necessary to be more magnanimous. So she sighed and reached forward. Then, picked some colorless and semi-transparent large crystal cluster from the empty position, as if it was already hanging there. She just made a simple move to take it down. That's it. Although it's difficult for us to make such a large scale one at once, it's not technically difficult. Although it can be understood that she is providing practical demonstrations to answer the questions raised by Ferris Manus, or the Emperor, even in the subspace, this scene is still a bit baffling for two primordial beings who only have the most basic understanding of spirituality. This kind of thing is difficult to understand with pure rationality and logic. Perhaps even after reading it multiple times, it is difficult to understand the principles behind it. In terms of principle, it is like using a plastic energy spell to gather the scattered ether around, but without giving them any specific directionality to what they will form. If the project can be safely and successfully completed, the result will be this type of ether block. Toshika Fujimaru waved the crystal cluster in her hand. This thing is not very useful, but because ether itself is a type of energy, the thing produced in this way also conforms to the law of conservation of mass and energy, so it can. She suddenly turned around and threw the crystal cluster out like throwing a shot put, so. The large translucent crystal exploded in the sky under the golden sky without warning. But the cost-effectiveness of doing this is very low, said Toshika Fujimaru, as if she knew what the two people next to her were thinking. She turned around to add, in special circumstances, when it comes to tactics, it can be said that in general, using this magic product to make explosives is far less effective than using magic to create an explosion. Then, based on this basic shaping theory, if a corresponding concept is attached to the ether by some means when it is restrained. Fujimaru Rika once again reached forward and this time she picked a ceremonial dagger adorned with rubies at the end of the hilt from an empty place, saying, "This is what we call creation out of thin air." Ferrus Manus stared at the short sword for a second and said, "What is the limit of this spell? Will factors such as the volume, mass, or complexity of the creation affect the completion of the final product?" "My situation is not good," Toshika Fujimaru replied. Although the most common way to achieve the effect of creating things out of thin air in magic is through the artist's own imagination adding concepts to the ether, this shaping technique is called projection magic. But that method requires the artist to understand what they want to create at the atomic level and perfectly replicate it through imagination, which is too difficult for me to learn. I am basically a summoning wizard, so strictly speaking, my method of making things is a kind of soul-lowering technique. Conrad Kaz showed some interest in this. Surrender. A spell that uses various rituals to capture and communicate with the souls of specific deceased individuals. Well, it's normal to first think of the human soul when it comes to the spirit of soul-lowering. However, in a broad sense, soul-lowering is applicable to the theory of all things having souls, which roughly means that a piece of stone, a piece of grass, or something that has been used for a long time has its own soul. Fujimaru Rika explained, "For me, the process of weaving objects with magic is: first, draw the necessary magic from around or from oneself, then select the corresponding concepts or legends from the database that can be used as the soul of objects, and let these two combine with each other. Through the influence of the non-material soul on the natural existence of the material form, the ether will naturally solidify into what I want." Appearance. As she spoke, Toshika Fujimaru pulled out a blaster gun from mid-air to demonstrate, tossing the weapon, which was too big for her, to the seemingly eager Ferrus Manus. This technique, because the process of forming objects is basically automatic, does not need to consider the issue of casting accuracy. As long as the magic is sufficient, anything can be made. If the concept itself is not wrong, there is no difference in strength compared to the actual object, which is very friendly to me as a half bucket of water. If you want to say where the limit is, why not ask the Emperor if he can give it a try here? Anyway, I think the Emperor should consider the living environment of his employees long ago. Looking down to study the exploding bullet gun that seemed to have just come off the production line, Iron Hand Gengen raised his head in confusion and said, "What do you want to ask?" Using psychic telepathy. Then he discovered that Toshimaru Rika had already held up another golden scepter that appeared out of thin air. As if gilded all over, beautifully carved, with a top statue of a flapping standard imperial eagle ready to fly, inlaid with broken diamonds at the line, overall very imperial. This type of item with a special logo and symbolic significance is obviously not something that Fujimaru Rika, who did not recognize himself as an imperial, would have chosen to make on his own. So, the Emperor did it. The girl complained expressionlessly, "I just asked him what architectural style he wanted, and he just handed me this thing. He must have been peeking." "What is that?" Conrad Kaz asked curiously. He was certainly not asking about the shape of the scepter or its meaning, so Fujimaru Rika's answer had nothing to do with the above question. Something like the administrator privileges in the subspace domain that the Emperor belongs to. It seems like with this, I can use the Emperor's psychic power as ether. Although I know I shouldn't complain when I take this, I really hope he can make the appearance a little low-key. The girl sighed and closed her eyes to concentrate and enter meditation. Almost in the next moment, the two pathogens present immediately understood why. As soon as Fujimaru Rika broke free from the illusion, he clearly described the aftermath of their struggle as a typhoon passing through. When the turbulence formed by the gathering of ether begins to surge violently, the feeling it brings to people is really like a typhoon. This is a process that is difficult to describe, as if the space they are in is also difficult to describe. The phenomenon brought about by the wave of subspaces is often difficult to explain with reason and logic, and the same applies to what is happening now. Fujimaru Rika just closed her eyes and held up the scepter she had obtained from the Emperor. Her face was calm and she seemed to have done nothing, but the waves of the ether washed around in a strange pattern. The first change to appear or be discovered was the emergence of gravity. At some moment, both of the two pathogens felt a clear sense of heaviness, and just as they adjusted their body, which had been slightly angled due to random drifting, and were preparing for their fall, the pristine and smooth marble floor appeared perfectly under their feet. Followed by thick and gorgeous carpets, exquisitely carved pillars, murals praising virtues, and solemn and elegant furnishings. Everything around them appeared out of thin air like a holographic projection spreading out, and in a few breaths, they cast a magnificent hall, and the building itself continued to extend towards the surroundings. Konrad Kaz first began to curiously move within this seemingly familiar building. He seemed to have restrained himself from leaving his original position far away, but what he did was far from being restrained. After a seemingly ordinary exploration, he came to a wall painted with a mural of a great victory led by the emperor during the Great Expedition. He stared at the painting for a few seconds, seeming to distinguish which specific battle it depicted. Then, just a second before the frowning Ferrus Manus was about to give a warning, he suddenly reached out his hand and used his nails in a bitter scraping sound. Considering his current form, it was not entirely certain that it was his nails, but it was definitely something very similar. With a few precise cuts, he cut out the solemn and shining face of the mural emperor, which was heavily depicted. It's hard to say for sure what kind of thoughts he had when he did this. Whether it was a prank to vent his frustrations, or a genuine resentment towards the emperor, or both. Anyway, after he did something bad, he immediately showed a very satisfied smile amidst the angry roar of Ferrus. Or perhaps the emperor's murals were just a reason, he just wanted to constantly provoke Ferrus with various methods here. However, before this provocation was truly escalated into a conflict, they were surprised to find that the damaged part of the wall was rapidly restoring its original state. The concept I have given to magic here is the Terra Palace at a certain moment in the 30th millennium. Fujimaru Rika stopped meditating at some point and casually poked her long staff, which was about the same height as her, onto the ground. Because the concept is a frozen moment, the internal scene will not change. Even if it is temporarily destroyed, the ether in the environment will attach itself to the concept, making the damaged area return to its original state. Ferrus Manus didn't react much to this, while Konrad Kaz let out a clear disapproval. Before he turned around and used the mural on the wall as a grabbing board for some kind of large beast to grind its claws, Toshimaru Rika promptly added. Also, the Emperor wants to speak to you alone, Mr. Konrad. He seems to have something to tell you. She strode towards Konrad Kaz with a scepter in her hand, her golden twin-headed eagle shining brightly in the magnificent palace. Can I take on the psychic communication? She casually extended the strongly symbolic scepter to Konrad Coates, who showed a very disdainful expression without concealing it. Can I refuse? He asked so. But from the fact that he had already reached out to the scepter while questioning, he was very clear that the answer was no. 9-star torch. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I never thought I would see such a sight again, Ferrus Manus sighed as he stood outside the palace hall. A still intact palace. This is simply a miracle. One of the creators of the miracle, Lixiang Fujimaru, simply sat on the steps not far away, looking a little uneasy. Perhaps so, she said. Beyond their line of sight, the scale of the architectural complex continues to expand. Nearby, there is only the same luxurious living area as the main hall they just left, and various exquisite artworks that match it emerge in the appropriate position. Then there are slightly further ceremonial venues, imperial dining rooms and audience halls, large conference halls and office areas. Further away are various laboratories, logistics hubs, art exhibition halls, and ecological gardens. And in places that ordinary people cannot see, secret treasure troves and prison cells quietly emerge. Each individual building is grand and luxurious like a palace, even in the most inconspicuous corners containing the highest level of beauty and wisdom among humanity, and they are just a negligible component of the entire architectural complex. The imperial palace is undoubtedly a great achievement of human engineering, and it is the largest single building and architectural complex in the history of Earth, or Terra. It goes without saying that such a large scale is enough to make this building famous in history, but the greatness of the palace lies not only in this. It is the dwelling place of the greatest individual among humanity, so it must be matched in all aspects with this greatness. The vastness in scale is only the least prominent component of this greatness that matches the emperor. The most exquisite works of art among all humanity here are just admission tickets that qualify to be placed in rooms as decorations. The carvings and murals created to celebrate the great expedition are all from the hands of top masters, not to mention the intricate and efficient technological equipment designed and built with the emperor's supreme wisdom, and even the terrifying creations passed down from the era of dark technology. Fujimaru Rika closed her eyes, but she was the performer who initiated this magic, the observer who drew out this concept. Even if she was unwilling, all the intelligence about the palace that had been extracted from history still rushed into her mind like a flood. If she objectively evaluates architecture, she cannot say anything bad about it, but what she sees is not just the architecture itself. Even in the 30th millennium of human history, in an era that was more rational, vibrant, and seemed to be improving, people could easily erupt into a religious fervor for emperors. She didn't want to calculate how many craftsmen had been buried under such a large-scale project, nor did she want to count how many stunning artists had driven herself crazy for an inconspicuous detail in the palace, nor did she want to discover how many conspiracies and schemes were being used in this magnificent place for the purpose of getting closer to the emperor, which can be said to be useless. But even if she only extracted a moment from the palace, those things still flowed clearly from her mind, just like when she opened a book and couldn't help but glance at other pages of content. She doesn't like this place, or in other words, she doesn't like the hidden message of the stars cheering the moon revealed in these buildings, nor does she like to receive widespread attention. She should have gotten used to it, but she can't do it. Even though she had joined the empire as a Nostromo in the illusion, adapted to its system, led the legion in a highly anticipated position, and spent over 100 years, she could only pretend to be accustomed to it. She certainly can't get used to it. Her spirituality had already stagnated before reaching the empire. No matter how much time passes again, she will always be the one facing the end, Rika Fujimaru. From the current perspective, this is a good thing. At least she has room for such optimistic thinking. In the subspace, the concept of space itself is very vague, so what can be accommodated here is not just a palace. She sat on the steps, grabbed her knee, looked up at the golden sky, and said, if the emperor wishes, as long as he continues to add ether to this creation, it can expand on its own. Judging from the emperor's total spiritual power, it is also easy to complete the concept of this palace as the entire planet. But it is best not to create a hollow mountain range. Ferris Manus lowered his head in confusion and said, why is this? Fujimaru Rika took the opportunity to shift her gaze from the sky to Ferris, saying, the hollow mountain range, to put it simply, is not a star torch generator, and our current position in the subspace is within the star torch. You cannot freeze the refrigerator inside it itself, as this would create a serious paradox. Even the best outcome would be that the star torch would explode itself with Terra, creating a huge subspace fissure in place. I didn't think of anything worse, I think it would be beyond my imagination. This is also too dangerous. Is there no way to avoid or remedy it? Yes, at the beginning, I asked the emperor whether he would pull the Himalayas mountain from other time points in advance. The name of the hollow mountain in the second millennium. To pull a mountain without stars and torches to sow in the hollow mountain, but he refused. Fujimaru Lixiang bowed his head and sighed. He meant that if there was a contingency, human beings also need a way to kill fish and catch them. After I reminded him of this, he thought it was good and could be added to his backup plan. After hearing these words, Ferris Manus pondered for a moment, stopped questioning, and simply sat down on the steps. I see, my father has his own considerations. I hope so. Fujimaru Rika commented with little hope that the emperor lacked some necessary respect and blind faith in various ways. although the Emperor himself seemed to quite like her attitude. Ferrus Manus clearly had some reservations about this, but before he could put his thoughts into words, Toshika Fujimaru had already started a new topic. Speaking of which, do you know what's going on with the storm border? I don't want to find out as soon as I leave subspace that my ship has been dismantled into parts. Bringing up work to change the topic may not always be effective, but for Toshika Fujimaru, it's enough to be effective this time. Rather than discussing whether to show more respect to the Emperor, Ferrus Manus is clearly more interested in discussing a small ship loaded with lost technology. He almost immediately forgot the unpleasant moment a few seconds ago and said enthusiastically, "Your ship is not big, so it can be hidden in the hangar of the palace in reality, and the Imperial Army is in charge of her." It was said that the Imperial Army was in charge, but Fujimaru Rika dared to bet anyone that Ferrus must have secretly studied that ship in some way. At least the excessive understanding he showed when explaining the progress and details of the renovation is far beyond what he claimed to be able to achieve by sneaking a glance behind the curtain when passing by. For Ferrus, who was active around the 30th millennium during his lifetime, the technology of the second millennium of humanity is of course like 1 + 1 = 2, which can be seen through at a glance, but the parts related to magic are another matter. There are differences in the underlying logic of the mysterious operation between two different worlds. The storm boundary contains many spells or structures that even the Emperor, who is a spiritual master, may find confusing after reading them. But these things that seem completely useless to the Emperor's knowledge can only be explained as being able to function normally. This ultimately can only be explained as having magical powers. Even the Emperor cannot exhaust all the mysteries of the world. After all, Toshika Fujimaru's creation magic of endowing the concept of objects with ether to shape energy on its own sounds outrageous to the Emperor. From a spiritual perspective, upon careful consideration, it becomes a mystery-level issue from beginning to end. Although the Emperor recently used his spiritual power to create a scepter out of thin air, these two seemingly similar phenomena are completely different in terms of logic. In addition, compared to psionics, the system of magic is more systematic and logical, at least different from psionics. When magic operates, it symbolically follows the laws of physics. This kind of thing naturally attracts the attention of the Iron Hand, who has done almost nothing other than war for 10,000 years. The topic was instantly shifted by Ferrus from, because there are too many unexplained structures inside the ship, and in the real world, it has not been too long, so currently only some Imperial equipment has been installed on the storm boundary, to exploring the functional testing and operating principles of the Triton engine. Therefore, Fujimaru Rika quickly lost her voice. She had been using the refrigerator for a long time, but she really didn't know how to cool it. What about those people who know refrigeration now? Ferrus Manus finally realized that Fujimaru Rika's emotions were not high after 3 beats of silence. He has never had the patience to use some indirect techniques in language, so he asked directly, "Is there any problem?" "No." The girl retracted her legs back onto the steps and hugged her knees. "I just suddenly felt a little emotional that this ship wasn't mine. I suddenly missed the original captain and crew, and felt a bit of sadness like, 1 achievement and 10,000 bones withered. She reached out her hand and randomly gestured some meaningless figures in mid-air, saying, "You see, after a devastating victory, most of the names of the campaign commanders will be widely sung. However, commanders may even stay at the command center throughout the entire campaign, with no enemy killed. The unnamed soldiers who died on the battlefield are the ones who truly make the campaign successful, but apart from the Legion itself or specialized narrators, no one even cares if they actually exist." Is this related to our topic? It was entirely through the efforts of her original captain and crew that I was able to take this ship to the Empire. I didn't do anything, I was just a boarder. But in the end, she became my ship because I was the only living person on board. Toshika Fujimaru explained briefly, feeling a bit foolish to explain this matter seriously. She sighed and stood up from the spot, looking straight at the fierce and cold face of Frust sitting on the side. "Forget it, you can just think of this as a teenage girl who has nothing to do and thinks recklessly, so you just need to suddenly moan without illness, don't worry about it. Ferris opened his mouth with a really inexplicable expression, but before he could make a sound, he was interrupted by a burst of hurried footsteps coming from behind. Conrad Kaz carried the golden scepter and blew it over like a gust of wind, throwing it into the arms of Fujimaru Rika, who turned around to face him. He didn't say anything, but everyone could tell that he really wanted to curse. What's wrong? Fujimaru Rika, who was stumbling with a scepter, asked first. Conrad Kazdan paused for a moment, seemingly trying to swallow words that did not match the noble status of the pathogen before speaking up. He thinks your mission requires an extra battalion. He said he wants me to recruit. This sentence seemed to poke at some switch of Ferris Manus, causing his originally calm emotions to explode in a flash at Shuyuan www.zhaoshuyuan.com. This is a subspace, so this kind of explosion can be observed in a practical sense, even making Toshima Rika instinctively reach out and press her skirt. The trust in the Emperor made him not say anything excessive in the end, but this barely advisory sentence was completely squeezed out of his teeth. The second chance is very rare, you'd better not disappoint all of this. Conrad Kaz was very obviously intentional, and showed a disdainful expression towards his brother. But before he really spoke up and started another conflict, Toshika Fujimaru asked. So, are you unhappy because you don't want to enlist? Your Excellency, it's a clear reference. The pitch-black bat even jokingly saluted when answering her. When dealing with Toshika Fujimaru, Conrad Kaz's attitude was not as sharp. Especially when compared to his attitude towards Ferris a few seconds ago, it could be described as a heaven and earth. This clearly gave Iron Hand a lot of words to say, but in the next moment, he immediately understood how this temperature difference came about. Then it's over if we don't recruit, said Toshio Fujimaru with a natural attitude. He feels that the need for conscription is due to the need for a non-establishment combat group. As long as we have such a military force in our hands to complete the task, he won't be able to control whether you recruit or not. Conrad Kaz pondered for a moment and said, you make a lot of sense, but the question is, where should this non-establishment combat group come from? To his surprise and also to the surprise of Ferris, Fujimaru Rika appeared very confident. I have a plan about this matter.